2, 1, hit it.
Welcome, Danbury, Richfield, and Bethel, to this evening's edition of the Chris Ponte Show for today, May the 24th, 2016. Ponte Show number 29 for those keeping track at home. A very, very special guest with me this evening, a person that is doing her best and getting incredible results with uncovering the corruption that exists in the world today and helping the people of this country relieve themselves of the debt that has been put upon us by the global corporate network control that exists. My guest is Karen Udis, and we welcome Karen to the Chris Ponte Show, and we'll call this Global Currency Chat number 3. Karen, thank you so much for coming.
Chris, thanks for having me on again.
Now, just so you know, Karen has come up all the way from Washington, D.C. I mean, it's not next door, and to do this show. So first, we want to thank you for that. But you've made this trip twice before, and we're on show number 3. Tell me the inroads, do you think, and the things that have been accomplished by at least discussing these things and getting them up onto social media?
Well, you know, we've been viral, Chris. And that's because people are very interested in seeing what we have to say.
Exactly. Because you know what? People get the idea that something is wrong, but they don't know who to blame. So the system has turned person A against person B, which is just what folks behind the system want to happen, instead of an examination of the facts to see where things lead, the history of things. Because the feeling is when good, well-minded, fair-minded people band together, there's nothing we can't accomplish, correct?
That's correct, and there is now a coalition for the rule of law across the entire planet. And we know this with absolute certainty because of a power transition model that came to the World Bank in 2004 from the Department of Defense, the National War College. Jacek Kugler brought it to the World Bank. And he did that deliberately because he knew that was the platform for the people of the world to take back their world from this network of global corporate control. And that power transition model has been tested in the Department of Defense, and it's 90 to 95% likely that we're going to take back our world.
Awesome. If you wish to speak with Karen, give us a call at 203-792-4101. It's on the screen right now. We're going to hear questions and field questions on everyday things like birth certificates and credit cards and fiat currency and what the Federal Reserve actually is. Things that affect everyday life for us. Before we get into those things, it's important to set the foundation of the root of all corruption. Let's talk about state capture. What exactly is that?
Just think if you were the person who had the right to print money and you could just bribe anybody you wanted to, or you could threaten anybody you wanted to, and you were the one who was printing all of the world's money. That's state capture, and we have it.
And it's come in the form, in the physical form of the dollar that is being presented to us by the Federal Reserve. And there are a lot of people out there that don't know what the Federal Reserve is, but we all deal with money. So let's open up with that. Who is the Federal Reserve and what is the Federal Reserve?
I can tell you with absolute accuracy because of a study that was done at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland. The Federal Reserve is at the very center of a network of global corporate control. They have bought up 60% of the earning capabilities of the 43,000 transnational companies. They have 40% of the assets, and they're exercising 10 times the power that they normally would be entitled to, because what they did was they took the same directors and put them on interlocking boards. And that means that just think of any company, chances are it is controlled by the network of global corporate control.
Is it And I just thought of this question as you were speaking, because this is like an everyday thing. How would you describe the stock market? Is that a controlled arm of the Federal Reserve and the network of global corporate control?
Yes, it's a total Ponzi scheme. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, those people are lying. They're just working for the network of global corporate control because the federal government is part of that corporation. The federal government is a corporation. They've incorporated themselves into a company.
And let's talk about, we always hear in wonderful terms, I'm going to Washington, D.C. But at a closer look, what exactly is the District of Columbia?
The District of Columbia, to put it mildly, is a booby trap for the United States. In 1871, when they enacted the law for the District of Columbia, they also adopted a second secret constitution of the United States. And therefore, they have said that any of the states were actually doing business in the District of Columbia as a corporation. And they incorporated, that means they turned the states into companies.
I see. And essentially, this is something that they didn't exactly teach us in public school. And another thing that they didn't teach us in public school was the Federal Reserve. And when I grew up, when I heard the word Federal Reserve, I just thought it was an elected part of the federal government that just had the power to print the money as we needed it. But at a deeper review, we see that originally it was supposed to be the Congress that was supposed to issue the money. And our representatives were supposed to be in that Congress so that you could use discipline as far as debt to make sure that we always ran things in the black and we ran our financial situations all with great responsibility. But that's not what happened in 1913 with the Federal Reserve.
That's right. And the Federal Reserve note is not really the same thing as the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar could be printed by the Treasury Department. And if that were the case, then you would be able to keep the difference between what it costs to print the dollar and the face value of the bill. Whereas now they call that country debt. They charge interest on country debt. And when we pay our income taxes, they all go to the bankers to pay interest on country debt. Now, what happened in Canada was up until 1974, they had their Treasury Department issuing their currency, and then all of a sudden, they turned it over to a private bank, which is what the Federal Reserve is. It's a private bank, and then charged interest on country debt. So the Canadians were then part of this scam. It's just a Ponzi scheme.
And how did they go from having this occur with them as far as this central bank? Obviously, there had to be something from behind the scenes where money was changed. Now, that's very important to see how these people, and I call them parasites, get involved in countries.
The Titanic was deliberately sunk because the people who would have prevented the Federal Reserve from the legislation that adopted the Federal Reserve, they put that through at Christmas when nobody was there.
Correct.
It was all engineered to snooker the American people and to trap them. But fortunately, we have a way out of this trap, and it's a peaceful way. The person who engineered the transition is a genius named Jose Rizal, who was fighting Spanish colonialism in the Philippines, and then he miraculously survived a firing squad. He went to the Vatican, and he rose through the ranks. He became the superior general of the Society of Jesus. Some people call these people Jesuits. And in the end of World War II, he was the one who could decide what to do with the world's wealth. And what he did was he put it in a trust for the benefit of humanity. And Ferdinand Marcos was his lawyer, and they got all of the leaders of the world at the time. It was President Truman and General Eisenhower who signed this agreement for the United States. That agreement is called the Bilateral Mansfield Breakthrough Successor Agreement. And they put the world's gold and other wealth in trust for 50 years. And the idea was at the end of the 50 years, the countries who belonged to the World Bank, their ministers of finance on the Board of Governors, would decide what to do with the world's gold. And John Kennedy actually accessed those monetary gold reserves. He signed an agreement called the Green-Hilton Agreement, and 8 days later he was assassinated. Ronald Reagan accessed the U.S. monetary gold reserves in the Global Debt Facility. That's another name for this trust. And that was why Hinckley shot him. But Ronald Reagan printed treasury dollars, and they're on deposit in the Union Bank of Switzerland. They're just waiting to be exchanged for the Federal Reserve notes. And that's exactly what the countries of the world had decided to do. At the last spring meetings in April, there were minutes that were approved. And we're going to be putting the Federal Reserve and the other central banks that are members of the Bank for International Settlements out of business because these banks issued bonds. They're called Treaty of Versailles bonds. They did this back in the 1930s. There were $270 trillion worth, but they carried interest that has been compounding, and now these bonds are worth $2 quadrillion. That offsets country debt. So when they're asking us to pay interest on our country debt, we tell them, well, you haven't been paying your interest on your Treaty of Versailles bonds, and one offsets the other. So we're getting out of country debt. We're getting out of the scam. We have liens on the 12 Federal Reserve banks in the various states, and the Federal Reserve is ignoring them, but it's not going to continue very much longer because we are going to take back our currency.
And it's up to the president, whoever it is, a sitting president. You mentioned that Kennedy and Reagan tried. The president has to access, like for this country, the president has to access this gold for the country by signing something into law. What is the process of that, taking that gold that's in that trust and getting it to the countries that it was stored away for?
You always ask such insightful questions, Chris.
I apologize.
It's not quite that simple because we're actually under martial law. That happened in 1861 during the Civil War, and ever since then, the Congress has been declaring a state of emergency behind closed doors, and we've been under martial law. So the president is just sitting there like a figurehead. He's taking orders, and the one who's actually in charge right now, it's General Dunford, but the countries of the world have put General Dunford out of business in his martial law, and we have declared the United States in interregnum. That's to say that the people of the United States did not accept General Dunford as a dictator.
Now, most people have never heard about this guy, but he exists. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. And from what you just said before, just to do a little review, we have been in martial law since 1861, since the Civil War, so that if there wasn't martial law, if it was ever lifted, okay, we could get at this gold and no one would get shot at. Would that be the end result of something like this?
We can now get at that gold because the people who decide what to do with the gold are the Board of Governors of the World Bank and IMF. And Jack Lew has now been removed from the Board of Governors because he has been breaking the articles of the World Bank and IMF. And I'm actually now voting for the United States during this interregnum until the Constitution of 1789 goes back into effect.
How do we get that Constitution to go back into effect? What are the steps that have to be taken?
This is what happened to Justice Scalia, because he was trying to do exactly that when he was murdered in Texas.
All right, hold it here. On me here. We're about to talk about something from the inside. You know, Judge Scalia, you know, he went on a little hunting trip, and then he ended up dead. Okay? And let me tell you something, people. They don't commit suicide like you're being told. They don't die of natural causes like you're being told. Okay, and Karen's going to explain to you what happened to Justice Scalia. Do a little backup of what you were presenting to him, and then we'll go forward with his death.
Well, the fact that the Constitution of 1789 is not in force and effect, and that we have martial law, the legal profession, it's their job to tell you whether when you go into a federal court, whether you're going into a court under the Constitution or whether you're going into an administrative proceeding, which is where the courts are. The judges, the federal judges, are not doing what they have given their oaths to do. And their oaths are supposedly bonded. The fidelity insurers are taking the premiums for the fidelity insurance, and they're not issuing the premium. They're not issuing the policies for that. So we have a situation which is totally out of control, and the legal profession has been complicit with this. And so I called Justice Scalia on the carpet. There was a cartoon that showed him and Justice Clarence Thomas, and it said, don't people understand what the Supreme Court is? And I put this cartoon on my public access TV show, and I believe that Justice Scalia was going to explain what the actual situation is. He was going to do his job on the Supreme Court. He was not going to be complicit in a matrix. That's what I believe. But in any event, we will never know, because there was supposed to be an autopsy. If you're in Texas and you die outside of a hospital, you're required to have an autopsy. They flew his body out before the autopsy could be performed, but I understand that he was found with a pillow over his face.
Correct. And the person that President Obama wants to replace him with, why don't you tell our viewers about the type of lad he is?
Merrick Garland was one of the 3 judges on my case in the D.C. Circuit Court. What happened was I was talking to the Board of Executive Directors, and I was telling them that the corruption in the World Bank was so great that they had to start acting like a true board. What happened right from the get-go at the World Bank is it was subjected to state capture. There was a memo that was written that said the president is going to take all the decisions and the board is going to be a rubber stamp. And I was talking to the Board of Executive Directors, and I was telling them that the corruption was so bad that they had to exercise their actual powers. And then I was locked out of the building, so I bought a World Bank bond, and then I sued in the courts. And my case had gotten to the appellate court, and Merrick Garland was one of the 3 judges on that panel. What they did was they canceled the oral arguments, they affirmed the decision of the lower court, whereas the way the case was brought, they were required to decide the decision, it's called de novo, as if there had never been a decision in the lower court. And I went to the panel and I said that the case had been settled, because it was. The Board of Governors settled the case, and the clerk refused to accept the settlement. And then I went to the panel and I said, by the way, you're not even sitting in a constitutional court under Article 3, you're sitting in some kind of a wacky administrative proceeding. And so this is the kind of judge that needs to be on the Supreme Court?
No. How would an everyday person know they weren't sitting in a court that was true? That you mentioned Article 3, Article 5. How would an everyday person know this?
Well, all you have to do actually is look at the flag in those courts.
Talk to me about that.
It's got yellow fringe around it.
And I was told this, that you see the flags. Didn't that mean like Admiralty, British Admiralty? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? It was the yellow fringe around the flag, not just, I mean, you see the old shots of courts that had just the flag in there. Then they started adding the yellow fringe. What does that mean?
That means that they're not real courts. And what I did at the end of the spring meetings, after the currency reset had been approved by all of the countries, was I went to all of the governors and the adjutant generals. This is their liaison to the National Guard. And I said, if I'm incorrect and the Constitution of 1789 is still in effect, why don't you tell us that? Otherwise, we are under martial law, and that martial law is not continuing. That martial law is now ended, and we are now in interregnum until we can get our true Constitution back into effect. I said this crazy 1871 Constitution where the United States is viewed as a corporation. And the other thing that happens in this state of illegality is that when somebody pays off their mortgage and they think they have the title to their home, no, they have a fake warranty of title. The actual title is with the bankers.
Now, what does that mean? Because my parents have paid off their house, and they think they're the owners of the house. What would be a situation that could come up in their lifetime that could unseat them from that house if they're not the true owners?
Oh, it's happening all the time, Chris. People who have paid off their homes are being thrown out in the street because there is no true law in effect right now.
But why would, what would be the cause? In other words, they would go up to my parents and say, you know you've paid off this mortgage, you hold a deed, but it's a fake deed, now you have to leave. They could do that.
They do that, Chris. They're doing that.
Wow. That's craziness. I want to talk about something you mentioned that the Congress does in secret, because unveiling secrets is why I do this show, or at least try to, and I can't unveil many of them without people like yourself showing up. The extension of the martial law. You say that they actually vote on this. Now, of course, this vote doesn't end up on C-SPAN, now does it?
No, it doesn't.
But is there a report in the annals, in the logs of Congress, that shows that these votes do take place?
They're done behind closed doors. They will have some kind of an executive session, and they'll give a different reason for why the executive session is taking place, and then they'll do that. And not a single congressperson will admit this to the American people.
And you believe, or you know, is this like a feeling you know that this has taken place, or you have come across concrete proof that this has taken place?
Chris, I know it has to have taken place, or else we would not be allowed to be under martial law.
I see. And so if they ever got a sense of conscience to reverse this, you would see a change in our everyday life, wouldn't you? If all of a sudden we weren't under martial law, there would be because there's a lot of people out there that are just waiting for the next shoe to drop in our lives, the next attack or the next edict from the government. I mean, I use this executive order as an example of martial law. How many has this president done? And they all do it in the last 4 or 5 months that they're in, and they sign these things, and he sounds like a dictator. He sounds like a king. Yes, I'm talking about this president. Yes, I'm talking about the transgender crap, okay? About the bathroom crap. Call up and fight with me. It is disgusting. This stuff goes, and it drives Mr. and Mrs. Joe Everyday in this country crazy that this kind of stuff goes on in a government that's supposed to be a representative republic. How do they get away with this?
I'll tell you how. It's the legal profession. So I went to a conference of the National Conference of State Legislators, and there was an expert, a lawyer, who was the expert on protocol in the U.S. Congress. And I asked him at that meeting whether the Congress had been extending a state of emergency. He said he didn't know. How could he not know?
Well, they're all. It almost get. You know what? The problem is, you can tell when you ask a real question because they don't answer it. That's how you can tell. You see it on TV. You see it. You see when people a microphone is put in their place, and all of a sudden, they take the fifth. We don't have access to the truth. These people that go to D.C. as congressmen and senators and whatever's going on in the Oval Office now, it's a freak show. It's an absolute freak show. And to me, it has been an intentional attack on decency. Intentional attack. And none of these representatives want to be the one to sit in front of the camera and say, you're right. You guys have all been taken to the hoop. You guys have all been hoodwinked. It's awful. And the currency is an example of this hoodwinking, isn't it? You know, the fiat currency. Let's talk about what fiat currency actually is.
Fiat means it's just issued, because if you have honest money, it stands for something. It's valuable in and of itself. So in the United States, we are supposed to have currency that has precious metals, and we don't.
Have that.
It's unconstitutional what we have.
You're on the Ponte Show with Karen Udis. How are you?
Hey, how you doing, Chris?
Good.
Washington needs to be washed a ton, and the D.C. after it means deception and corruption. Talk to you later.
Well, you're absolutely right. What do you think about that little poetry? See, this is what people think.
They're absolutely correct. And I have said, I've made this point to Governor Bowser, that it's a very corrupt business environment, and that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which were created to determine what's going to happen to the world's monetary gold reserves. I told her that that organization is going to leave Washington, D.C., and it's going to take the opportunity of this country continuing, because what is going to happen if we do not replace our fiat currency is it's going to crash. It's on the verge. It's on life support, and we have to replace it before it crashes. And the likelihood, Chris, is that we do replace it. I was telling you about this power transition model. It's 90 to 95% likely that that's exactly what we do. And we're not just going to be replacing it with currency out of gold. And the way that works is you take gold and you press it very, very thin, and you put it in a plastic envelope that handles just like paper currency, but it's got the exact value of the face of the bill inside that envelope. But the most important currency is actually the local currency. And you've got, in some places, you've got this currency in the Berkshires, for example. That's where the businesses agree on a currency in that town or village, and it's used in trade in that village.
Right.
What that does is that creates full employment, and we're going to have this in all the countries of the world, in all the villages of the world. And we're going to have a world in which the bankers aren't telling people what to do and bribing the rest of the politicians. The politicians are going to be at the service of the people instead of at the service of the bankers, which is where they are now.
Let's talk about where this implosion is happening right now, and that is in the country of Venezuela.
Some people think that the price of petroleum was artificially lowered in order to make it very difficult for Venezuela to survive. And this is quite likely, actually, because this network of global corporate control is in charge of the prices. It's able to manipulate them, but only up to a certain point. At a certain point, the paper currencies become valueless because they've been flooding the markets. And certainly with the Federal Reserve notes, now that the other countries of the world are not agreeing to accept them. That's what happened with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's what happened with the G77. That's actually 134 developing countries. In Bolivia, they decided they're not going to be accepting the Federal Reserve notes. in exchange for the trade. So there's an excess, there's a glut on the world's markets of this currency.
So essentially what these people do, and I like to call them parasites and I'm being nice, they run the Bank of Venezuela and they have their little hands in everything and they implode the society, and then here come the globalists to take it over. And then they just mark Venezuela as their own territory. And they did it there. They're doing it in Puerto Rico. But let's turn our attention to what went on in Greece, because Greece is an ongoing story, correct? And let's talk about where Greece was, let's say, a year ago and where they are today.
Greece is a very important battleground in the fight to win our world back from this network of global corporate control. And what the Greeks have been saying now is that they can't continue to pay this interest on country debt, which just continues to mount like exponentially. And therefore, either the entire system is going to collapse, or we're going to have to replace it with actual currency, which is actually valuable. And right now, the Greek citizens are learning about the possibility of a global currency reset, and they're taking it. Why should they be paying interest on country debt when actually the bankers owe us more than we owe them? Because there's $2 quadrillion worth of bonds that they owe us.
And it's just sitting there. And what's interesting, it just goes to show you what people can do. In Greece, either the citizens rose up or their leader says, we're not going to take this anymore. And we need more leaders to do that. Right? Didn't you tell me that the person running Greece says, listen, I'm not getting involved with this. I'm not paying this, and we're going to figure out a way out of this. And the citizens at least have strong leadership. We don't have that in this country. They don't have that in Venezuela, and they don't have that in Puerto Rico.
What happens when you do get strong leadership is those leaders are moved aside. Look what happened in Brazil with Dilma Rousseff. They're deliberately trying to unstabilize those leaders that are actually doing something for their people.
Exactly. So the minute you stand up, they figure, okay, you're gonna run against us, so now we're gonna make it difficult, for the country. It's just like with 2 7-year-olds. You don't want to play the way I'm going to play. I'm going to take the ball and go home. It's just done at a higher level. So you either play with these vampires or they try to destroy you.
Well, what's happened is that people are now seeing what's been going on behind the concealed doors. Correct. And they're now making it much more difficult for this network of global corporate control, which is losing its ability to just print money by fiat and buy what they really wanted to do in Greece was to buy up the assets of the country.
Exactly.
And many of the Greek citizens were committing suicide under this mountain of debt.
Let's talk about the bankers. Folks, recently, and I'd say like in the last year or two, I kept on coming across these news items of all these bankers in this country that were committing suicide. There was a whole slew of them. Okay, let's talk about that. That wasn't just coincidence, was it?
No. What was going on is there's something called bank-owned life insurance. The banks were buying insurance policies on their employees, and they were killing the employees and collecting the life insurance on that. And I found this is what I had expected, and I found this out for sure by a gentleman named Mr. Dunn who got in touch with me. He told me that he had a lawsuit because they tried to kill him, and he managed to save his life, and then he brought this lawsuit on behalf of the other suicided bankers. And unfortunately, Mr. Dunn, I had to cut off contact with him because it turned out that he was how to describe him. He was a Satanist, and I don't have anything to do with Satanists.
You know, it's interesting because in the 90s, I applauded the first Bush going in Iraq, and obviously in 2003, I applauded W going into Iraq. It wasn't until later that I see that all these wars, who they profit and why these wars take place. It's always for country resources. We're going to implode areas and we're going to get all the resources. Now, folks, why would they hoard these things if at the bottom of it wasn't world government? Why? These people have more money than they ever can spend, but it's the power that's insatiable in these bankers or the people that are in this global corporate control. They don't love humanity. It is all about just like a desire that can never be quenched for more and more and more. And they hide away from the lights, away from scrutiny, and they essentially just pay everybody off. And it's been done in this country. Correct?
Well, it has, except that the tide has turned. Enough people have...
Let's talk about that.
Enough people have seen what's going on, and we have these institutions at the World Bank and IMF which are in charge of the world's monetary gold reserves.
Awesome. Let's just see. We're going to hold that thought. You're on the Ponte Show with Karen Udis. You're up.
Hey, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great.
I want, I know you're talking about the Federal Reserve, and I have studied it for a very long time. Now, here's the thing. How it applies to the economy today really concerns me, and I'm sure your guest will agree with me. Here's a big point. Say an area of the country is very depressed, and you need an influx of money, all right, to bring the area out of economic depression. And you go to the Federal Reserve and say, hey, we need funds. What can you do for us? And the interest rates are high. Well, look, you need, as a bank, to hand out funds, you need a very low interest rate. So then you can hand out loans to people to start businesses. All right? So the Federal Reserve, their model is not to look at each region of the country or each state and say, what does each state need in terms of funds to go into the local banks and to get the economies rolling again. So right now, you look, I believe the interest rates are very low in the Federal Reserve. So banks, are going to hand out funds at low interest rates. But again, the thing is you got to realize where there is inflation. That is a very bad factor on the economy. So you have to balance the two things. So in other words, if one area of the country is flying, is going through the roof, and you want to slow down inflation, you're going to have to bring up the interest rates to slow down. Now, in other areas of the country where it is depressed, say in here in Connecticut where we want to boom the economy, you're going to have to go to the Reserve and say, look, we need funds at very low interest rates. And that, to me, has been a real problem with the model of the Federal Reserve. Okay, and I'll let you go, all right?
Thank you, brother.
Yeah, good show.
Thank you, brother. Well, what he's saying, and this is a conversation for you and I. He's talking about, okay, if it's high here, it has to be low here to balance it off. My viewpoint is, why don't we have people running our finances that have a vested interest in the United States of America? That is my complaint with the Federal Reserve. It's not what they do, it's who are the ones doing it. That's where the destructive part of this is, correct? Because they don't have an interest in our welfare.
It's much, much worse than that.
Bring it. Tell me.
All of the income taxes that you are paying are leaving the country.
Tell camera 3. Camera 3, introduce yourself to Ms. Udis. She's going to tell you, we just got done with tax season. Okay, guys, you know I'm on camera one. I'm going to drop a little bomb on you, boys and girls. You just did your taxes and you're happy because you got $100 back. She's going to tell you where your tax dollars go. Go ahead.
100% of the taxes that you pay are leaving the country and they are going to the bankers. And we know this because the Grace Commission that Ronald Reagan asked to study into this showed. So you are working about 3 months out of the year so that your tax dollars can leave the country and go to the London, and after some of it goes to London, the rest of it goes to the Vatican. That's where your income taxes are going.
And isn't that cool that essentially for 3 months we're slaves? You know, you think this is the land of the free. And just so you know, it wasn't just Reagan who spoke on this. I heard Bill Clinton, one of the few things he's ever said that were true in front of a camera. Someone asked him, where do my tax dollars go? And I don't know if he misspoke, but he told you the truth. He said it goes to the banks. Your federal income tax does not run the government. It goes to the bankers. Everybody wears a big... You think slavery is about white people and black people? Slavery still exists today. It's anybody that goes out, gets a pay stub that has FICA on it. Slaves. That is the truth. Okay, you still think this country is there for you? You know, the Affordable Care Act was there for you? Well, you know, chipping is in the Affordable Care Act, but we're not going to talk about that. Let's talk about secret societies, because this is another thing that really burns my butt. Okay? The fact that when you stumble across the truth of this brotherhood that exists, and the most famous one, well, you hear about the Bilderbergs, which, by the way, we were told that doesn't exist, but guess what? It does. The Illuminati, just look up Stevie Nicks. She'll tell you she's in it, and it's real. But the main one I want to talk about is at Yale University, big beloved Yale called Skull and Bones. Does that exist?
Yes, and there was a question to John Kerry about that, whether he was a member of Skull and Bones. And this was in Florida. The student who was asking that question got tasered. I put that clip on my DC TV public access program, and YouTube refused to upload that program.
Well, you know, YouTube is run, Google, they're all run by CIA. I mean, guys, let me tell you something. I love Facebook too, but Zuckerberg is just, you know, he's a globalist. I don't trust atheists. He's all that stuff. God knows who he bends his knee to. All that stuff that is on Facebook, well, they're just building a dossier on you. Okay? When you look something up on Google, they know your interest. When you post something up on YouTube that is slightly controversial, the CIA gets involved. Correct? It's a complete farce. You know, what we think is out there for fun, to connect people together. No. That's what they tell you. But all this is to build cases against you. Right? And Skull and Bones is just a boys' network of people that are destined for great things. You know, Yale University, it's very difficult. And it becomes, okay, you do this for me here, and I'll do this for you there, and we all profit, and we watch mainline America go down the tubes.
There are loyalty oaths involved.
Talk about it.
They are. And so John Kerry is serving a foreign power. And we were talking about the legal profession. There is another amendment to our Constitution that was ratified against titles of nobility. And when the Brits came to this country and burned the country down, they took all of the copies that had that amendment in it and tried to destroy them. But there were a few copies left, and so people realized when the Constitution of 1789 goes back into effect, it's going to have a profound impact on the legal profession, because the legal profession, the way it's been operating, has been at the service of this network of global corporate control. Why is it that they're not telling you that the Constitution of 1789 was replaced by a second secret constitution.
Correct. And they look at someone like yourself and they think you're cuckoo. You know what I'm saying? And the indoctrination begins. Well, let's just talk. We were talking about this country and its history. Columbus came here in 1492. Then we met the Pilgrims. We all had turkey and yada, yada, yada. That's not what happened. This is not what happened. There are people that were already here. Talk about what's in the Moscow library in the catacombs.
That's the Moscow State University. What they have done is they've gone back and they've shown that the ancient history was deliberately falsified by some Jesuits, actually, is what they were. And so everything that you believe in your history book has been rewritten, actually. And so it goes on for 7 different volumes. I just learned that they were books. I thought it was a website. But a fellow named Nick Blaine told me about this. It's just one more proof that our world is not what we think it is. And we've all been working very diligently to try to reconstruct what the actual reality is. So to summarize, our currency is not real, it's paper. And we have real precious metals that are going to come out in reality. We're going to reconstruct our history. We're going to take back our original Constitution. And it's going to be a brilliant future. But the real risk is that during this transition, there are many people who have just believed all of these lies because they've been perpetuated in our school system, in our universities, and it's going to be very difficult for people who are just learning about these truths for the very first time.
It's almost, you hear these things for the first time and it feels like there's a muscle in your head that's being pulled because this is so counter to the indoctrination that starts from preschool to 12th grade and then in the colleges, that by the time you get your bearings in your 30s and you want to know why things are so lousy, because we were so idealistic when we were younger, and then we get out in the world and we saying, well, this is not my will for my life, it's not my neighbor's will for my life. Why are things the way they are? We got about 10 minutes left, and I want to talk about items that we all have in common and the truth behind these items. When I look at my birth certificate and when I look at my driver's license, why is it written in block letters? Because I've never signed my name that way. Yet when the state issues a driver's license, it's all in big letters. Social Security card, all in big letters. Talk about what is the significance of that.
This is because when you were born, there was a bond that was created. They floated your birth certificate on the capital market. They estimated how many tax dollars you were going to be paying in the future, and they do something called discounting it, which is they figured out what that income stream was going to be, they discounted it back, that was the value of the bond, and they floated it on the capital markets. And they've done that for everybody. And for your driver's license, same thing. And when you go into the court, actually, these fake courts with the yellow fringe around the flag, they don't see you as a human being. They see you as this bond that was created when the birth certificate was floated on the capital market. And we mentioned that in an earlier program. If you're married by a justice of the peace, he's marrying 2 birth certificate bonds. He's not even marrying the individual human beings.
Does that only happen with the JPs, or does that happen with clergy also?
No, clergy are marrying the individuals.
Oh, okay. But a justice of the peace, from that standpoint where people, in other words, they think they're legally married, are you saying that they're not legally married, or the union isn't what they thought?
There are 2 companies that are married.
Oh, okay. I see.
Can companies get married? No. You're actually not married if you were married in front of a justice of the peace. It's that bad.
You know, it's funny because I've never signed my name, capital C, capital H, capital R, capital S, in my life. It's always been capital C, small h, R-I-S. But if you look at the IDs, they give you this straw man, was the word they use. It's like a representation of Christopher Ponte that they only deal with that straw man. They don't deal with me as a human being because evidently I was bought and sold. And that's how we're dealt with.
Well, we have a whole opportunity now to retake our world, and that's exactly what's going to happen. But we've got to be very compassionate with each other because there are people who have been working on these problems and understanding them, and they have to start reaching out to the other people who are clueless and make sure that these people don't panic. But the likelihood that we come through unscathed is very high, and that's because, as I was explaining, we have the World Bank and the IMF that were specifically created so that we could take back our world and end this slave system.
So this is something that has been negotiated, and you're involved, and you're an overseer. So this is just happening day by day, and there have been victories along the way for people to hopefully get out of this currency system, hopefully get that gold that we can all receive, get away from this illegal debt. And you've seen a lot of victories towards that end, correct?
Well, I have to explain how this is going to happen.
Okay.
It's going to happen from the grassroots. In each community that's going to be issuing its own local currencies, and most of the decisions are going to be taken by these groups. The only thing that we have to decide relatively quickly is how to replace these Federal Reserve notes because they're toxic. So that's something that's going to proceed as quickly as we possibly can, and the rest, it's going to be up to people working in their communities to decide how they want their world to be fashioned. And we're going to use the framework of the Constitution of 1789, which is going to go back into effect. And in this interim period, because as I said, nobody consented to General Dunford's dictatorship of martial law. So that is no longer in effect. That second secret constitution of 1871 has been declared null and void. And we are now in an interregnum period, and we have to get back on track, which we will.
Okay. Do you see anything happening in the November election for president that might expedite this process with one person or another?
Well, let's talk about that election. Let's talk about the fact that the voting machines are there not to count the actual votes, but to be manipulated. In the previous election, when we had the presidential commission, the Commission on Presidential Debates, that is just a farce, because I was trying to let the people know what kind of international corruption there was so they could make a real choice. Because Mitt Romney's national security advisor, that was Robert Zoellick, who had been fired from the World Bank for his corruption, and people didn't know anything about it. I was trying to let them know, and CBS was bound and determined that this would not be something that anyone would understand. Now, you cannot have an election when the real issues are not out there. And I've gone to the candidates and I've asked them to tell people that the United States monetary gold reserves are going to be replacing the Federal Reserve notes.
And have they parroted these insights that you've given them? Have they received them? Do they believe them?
Well, I know for sure that they've received them because Donald Trump's lawyer sent me an email telling me that he had put that on Donald Trump's desk.
Okay,
No,
so
Donald
he is
Trump,
aware.
he is just, I'm sorry to say, and disappoint people who thought that he was a man of substance. He is just another one of these puppets. There's something called the Knights of Malta. He's a Knight of Malta. That means that he's treasonous. His loyalty is not to the people of the United States, it's to Rome. So when you're talking about the elections, if the people are not being told what's actually going on, that their monetary gold reserves, the ones that John Kennedy had given them and then was murdered for, and there's another issue that came up in the presidential election.
Real quick, you're on with Ponte and Karen Udis.
Yeah, yeah, a very interesting show. I just turned it on.
Okay.
Listen, what did this lady try to get a hold of Infowars and get her information over that? Her news outlet?
I will ask her that, and thank you for the call.
Thank you.
Alex Jones?
Okay,
Have interest in you?
Yes, I'll tell you about Alex Jones, but first let me tell you about Rick Santorum, who was asked whether there was an attempt to nuke Charleston, South Carolina on the 7th of October 2013 in the presidential primaries. That actually happened. Does anyone know about that? No, because the media is not telling people what's actually going on. There was such an attempt. There were two heroes who detonated this bomb off the coast. They were fired.
Right. And that's all part of the control is the everyday media, which, by the way, Karen told me that in a recent poll shown that only 6% of people believe what they're being told by the media. And I didn't know that, and I think that's fantastic. We're getting back to thinking for ourselves. We're getting back to asking the right questions. If you're not getting what you need over these over-the-air TV, you got your computer, you got what they call alternative information that you can acquire. I mean, you have library upon library upon library at your disposal, and it's going to help us to get this country back on the right track. Karen, the hour flew by. Thank you so much for coming up. In about short 10 or 15 seconds, offer folks our hope, some hope in camera 3.
Well, there is a lot of hope, but I want to say you have to be discerning. I didn't answer the question on Alex Jones. About 80% of the alternative media is really more of the same, and unfortunately Alex Jones he's not what he appears to be. So stay tuned, work hard, get in groups, and there is a lot of hope.
Thank you very much, Karen, and we'll be back in 2 weeks on the Chris Ponte Show. Stay alert, boys and girls.